Tying cyber to safety and economic impact is going to be a key theme to the board.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here with Andrew Ginter, Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions, who's going to introduce the subject and the guest of today's show. Andrew, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. We have two guests today, Michael Piccalo and Anthony Morrone. Michael is the Executive Vice President of Service Delivery at Level 5 Cyber, and Anthony is the Executive Vice President of Corporate Strategy at Level 5 Cyber. And our topic today is how to work with the Board of Directors on cybersecurity topics.
All right, let's get into it.
Hello, Michael. Hello, Anthony. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Level 5 Cyber?
Hey, Andrew. First, thank you for having us on today. We really appreciate this opportunity here. Let me start off first with a little bit about Level 5 Cyber, or L5C as we often call it. So Level 5 Cyber started off with a group of former colleagues and friends. Well, actually more like family now, since in some cases it's been over 20 years. We come from backgrounds that include the military, those that have worked very closely with the Department of Defense and many of the three-letter agencies. And we come from large Fortune 100 and 500 companies such as DuPont and Lockheed Martin. We have pretty diverse backgrounds, not only when it comes to our skill sets, but we've seen a lot of diversity within the organizations that we both worked for and those organizations that we've helped out along the way. Our experience ranges from establishing secure communications and protecting intelligence and data on the battlefields, working inside the aerospace and defense organizations, water facilities, nuclear facilities, chemical plants, and high-risk manufacturing environments. We have the experience of an executive from a Fortune 100 company in providing the security oversight for probably what was the largest merger in the world. We have members of the team that were a core part of establishing the commercial cyber group within Lockheed Martin once they decided to branch outside of the federal space. And we have staff that's provided technical and security guidance to the Department of Defense and many of the other government bodies associated with that. So we bring a tremendous amount of experience and perspective to the table and really want to help protect our national security and our national economy by bringing that expertise to the broader market and helping the organizations effectively defend themselves from advanced threat actors. As a result of our backgrounds, we do work quite a bit with regulated environments, which could be in the industrial manufacturing space, food processing, chemical sectors, basically those organizations that make up the DoD supply chain and have to adhere to DFARS, or the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, and the new CMMC requirements, which are cybersecurity maturity model certification that's basically knocking at our doors now. We work basically across most of the critical infrastructure sectors. But most of what we do, if not all of it, is really about understanding the risks. It's managing those risks and effectively remediating. A little bit of background on myself. Michael Piccalo, as you said, responsible for service delivery here at Level 5 Cyber. My background includes about 30 years in the cybersecurity field, starting with about 10 years in the military, working in the intelligence community, but also in communications and cybersecurity. After my tenure in the military, I did some consulting for the FBI for a little while before going to work for Citibank, which is actually where I first met Anthony. We were doing perimeter security. I was handling the Asia-Pacific region and helping out with securing the B2B connections there. So after that, I spent about 18 years, focused on securing operational technology or OT environments, working for companies such as EDMZ Security, Industrial Defender, which is basically where you and I first met, Andrew, Waterfall Security, Lockheed Martin's Commercial Cyber Group, Forescout. There were some others along the way as well in between there, but Forescout was the last one before we really started up Level 5 Cyber. So enough about me. Anthony, I'll turn it over to you for your intro.
Thank you, Mike. And Andrew, thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. So Anthony Morrone, as Mike said, we go back for together about 20 years. I've been in the IT security industry for around 30, starting in the financial world with MBNA and, of course, Citigroup, as Michael mentioned, before I went off and I started EDMZ Security, where we focused on securing high-risk manufacturing. From there, that's where I also met Andrew as part of Industrial Defender. And then I went on to work for one of our customers, DuPont, where I spent a little over 14 years moving through the security organization. I led the security organization through many of the mergers and acquisitions, if you're familiar with DuPont's portfolio changes over the years, up to and including the merger with Dow and spin into the 4 separate companies. And now we've moved off to startup L5C.
We're going to come to industrial security in a moment, but you folks have deep experience in manufacturing and in the chemicals industry. We're going to be talking about the board in a moment, but before we dive into that, can I tap you guys? I always like to ask people. I personally, I hope our listeners like to learn about different kinds of industries and the cybersecurity issues in those industries. Can I ask you about the chemicals industries? What's a typical site in this industry look like? How big is it? What kind of physical equipment do you find in the site? How's it automated? How does one of these big sites that you're very familiar with work?
Good question, Andrew. So I'll jump in. So let's just say that they are designed and look like they're focused on making product. You won't confuse one of these sites as a financial institution for sure. Much of the work, though, that we do in the manufacturing area, we actually do remote. So, in fact, I've probably have only been to a few dozen operating plants. Some of the reasons when you go to these plants, you have to go through typically an education process, watching short videos. They're really safety oriented. And some of the sites that you go into, you're going to get a course on wearing PPE. So if there is an incident, what would you do? What type of protective garments do you have? But I think what's common across all the sites are 3 themes. I think you probably hear this a lot, and that is safety, physical, and cyber security. So they're really kind of blended together. And the size of these sites, so, they can really range from square feet to square acres. It really depends on the complexity of the production. The more complex a site might be, they might actually produce some of their intermediate products on site. And so they will just pipe them over to the finishing rather than trucking them. So it really depends on what they're making. Going into what types of equipments, as I said, since we're talking about process, the processing types of plants, you're going to find lots of piping, lots of tanks. Depending upon what they make, you might also find berms built around certain areas just in case there is a spill or containment. When you look inside these plants, typically you're going to find an assortment of control systems. You may have heard terms like historians, PLCs, HMIs, barcode readers, and kind of really coming on the scene, IoT. I mean, we've heard a lot about IoT. You're going to find it in the manufacturing area as well. You're going to find a lot of specialty built equipment. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention going through some of these sites is almost like going into the Smithsonian. You will see systems that haven't seen IT in probably 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. So some of those operating systems they're very old. And that has implications, which we could talk about. When you get into the automation and how you actually supervise and manage these, well, that could vary quite a bit based on the complexity of the processes running. They go from no automation to highly automated, obviously. So some of the drivers in that process or in that decisioning might be what are the brands of PLCs that you have. So certain PLC brands might require more automation, might need to have connectivity back to their vendors. Also, do you have a requirement to integrate your process control into your ERP or an SAP, since that's one of the more prevalent? It's fairly common. Larger sites, you're going to have control rooms that are used to manage that process. And control rooms might look very familiar, just, screens that you have processes running on them. But when you look behind the covers, depending upon how that company has embraced segmentation and some of the standards, it could be very different. Looking at, I mentioned IoT, and this is something very interesting, kind of within the past few years, really seen it coming on the scene. And how do they use IoT in process control? Measuring motor vibration, measuring oil consumption, looking at your people, understanding the biometrics. Where are the people at any given point in time? Where are the vehicles? So they add a lot of ability to monitor from a safety, monitor from a life cycle management, and they bring a lot of efficiency into the production environment. But when you look at it and you kind of step back, there could be risks when you introduce that automation. So you could go from no automation, then your risks could be focused around human error. As you introduce those automated processes, you also introduce computing devices. And when you do that, the threats are pretty much in line with what you might see in IT, the same type of threats. IoT, kind of interesting, the points that the benefits I mentioned above, well, they come with risks as well, because those devices have to connect back to some service that's out on the internet or someone who's providing those capabilities. All these risks can be broader than what you might find in IT from standard IT risks. They could have significantly higher impact with the potential to damage equipment, product loss, even environmental impact. And of course, last but not least, but don't forget the health and safety of the workers and the surrounding communities as well.
So a clarifying question there. You talked about risk. I've had conversations with other experts, if I recall correctly, even other guests who've argued, risk is risk. On business networks, there can be very serious consequences if you steal, the design for the next, iPad or iPhone, or if you, steal the design information or other information for, a jet fighter. They've argued that you can quantify risk and that the process of OT risk management is really not different in kind from any other kind of risk management. It sounded like you're saying something different. Can you dive into that for me?
Absolutely. That is a great question. And I think that actually goes to a core value, I think, that I've learned at DuPont over the years. And as I said, when you have a compute device, whether it's an IT or OT, there are certain risks that go along with that device. Loss of intellectual property, absolutely. It's analogous between the two. Where I think it diverges is that an IT risk, and this might sound rather straight, but an IT risk typically is not going to kill someone. When you're in an OT environment, specifically in such a manufacturing area, and a cyber incident can destroy your manufacturing capabilities if you abruptly stop a manufacturing process, that stuff in the pipes can destroy your manufacturing capabilities. If you stop an ERP system, you're going to go to your journal log and restart it. But when you destroy a pipeline, you have bigger issues. And there's also which leaps beyond any financial loss, and that's the loss of life. If you actually, and I'll talk a little bit about this down the ways, but the impact from a cyber incident to health and safety to the workers as well as the community, I think far outweighs the risk of a monetary impact to an SAP or, a front office IT.
One question I had about what Anthony was just talking about there, he was talking about disrupting pipelines, like shutting them off. And then he started talking about destroying them in just a few words later. Andrew, I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, does shutting off, large pipelines cause them to be destroyed? I'm thinking about the Colonial attack recently, where I can't recall if there was any concern over health and safety.
Well, Anthony was talking about piping. There's a lot of piping in chemical plants. I don't think he was talking about, crossing the continent with a petrochemical pipeline. To your question, though, I did read that after Colonial had shut down their cross-continental gasoline pipeline, they positioned people all the way down the pipeline to watch the pipeline. I'm guessing they didn't say why they did this. They did this for safety. But, beyond that, I'm guessing, if with ransomware running around, perhaps they didn't trust the SCADA system enough. Perhaps they wanted, human verification of these values to make sure that everything was still, in a safe state in the pipeline. In a chemical plant, there's a lot of piping. And again, I'm not a piping expert, but my dim understanding of it is that there's at least two kinds of risks. One is that if you shut everything down sort of hard in an emergency mode, there can be pressure waves that fly around, and these waves in these pipes can be powerful enough to either, rupture bits of the pipe or to damage valves and such and cause them to open when they shouldn't be open. This is why there's berms, he mentioned, in some of these sites. If there's a spill, to catch the spill so it doesn't go anywhere. And the piping is designed sort of for controlled shutdowns. If you have an uncontrolled shutdown, you might leave the wrong stuff sitting in a pipe too long. And I don't know, there might be corrosion problems. There might be, plastic or something solidifying in the pipe, and now it won't move anymore because it lost too much heat. There's issues with emergency shutdowns in these very large facilities. When you shut one of these sites down, you really need to shut it down in a controlled way so that you don't suffer any of this equipment damage. Our topic is cybersecurity and communicating with the board of directors. When you're talking to the board about security, where do you start?
The what for me is really about the changes to the threat landscape and the escalation of impact. So tying cyber to safety and economic impact is going to be a key theme to the board. So a cyber event, as we were talking about earlier, in your OT environment from a process manufacturing is going to be can be a significant impact to a company. If your board has an EH&S or your environmental health and safety subcommittee, that would be a good place to start, because this is going to be a key focus of that group. So a key point that you're going to have when you talk with this group is going to be that, you could mention that the threat landscape is always changing, but it's the impact that is going to get their attention. And you also have to keep in mind your vocabulary and how you communicate this to the board is going to be very much a business perspective, but the EH&S group is always a good place to start. The so what about the impact to me is, so the adversary's drivers are typically going to be monetary and geopolitical. And I'll get into some examples about those. So the adversaries over the years have really turned into, we'll just say they've turned into businesses. They have business plans. They understand how they're going to attack. They understand what their goals are. And as we've seen with the recent attacks of late, and I think Mike is going to talk about those, it is really a business strategy. So nation states, well, they have various different motives, and we could look at a few of what those are. So if you look at maybe over the past 10 years or so, when you look at an adversary intent of espionage, we've talked about loss of intellectual property. In the OT environment, Havex was one of those types of malware. So we had a nation state, again, trying to steal intellectual property. Again, with the nation state, looking at business disruption, we have Shamoon, where there were tens of thousands of systems that were literally destroyed, data loss. Again, a nation state attack, if you look at their motives. Moving into the adversaries that are in it for the money, operational disruption. We have all of the family of CryptoLocker and ransomware that are out there. And their intent is really, they need to put a company in a position where they have to pay a ransom. They're all about the money. The impact to the business, we've seen many large businesses faced with this, complete loss of business data, loss of business processes, brand impact, significant recovery cost, and in keeping with their business model, a lot of these adversaries have added theft of your IP to really ensure that you're going to pay that ransom. So now they're stealing your intellectual property. It could lead to a PII breach, potentially a PCI breach, etc. Going on again back to the nation state impact. So you have an operations impact, and looking what we had out there was the Stuxnet. We've had the Ukraine outages. And really their goal was to impact production, impact the products from those companies or governments. Finally, moving towards, I guess, my point of the last discussion about health and safety. When you have an adversary who's actually focused on driving health and safety impact, actually killing people, that really drives it to a board level discussion. Mass casualties from a company perspective are catastrophic. We look at actual attacks on safer systems, like with the Triton attack. Again, this was a few years ago. I guess in summary, the risks from a board perspective, millions of dollars in recovery costs and loss of product, loss of life and limb, brand impact, intellectual property loss. A lot of these are like the IT side as well, which are going to impact your price points or even your markets that you could work in. So I guess the key point here is these issues are board level issues, and they need to be brought to the board for their awareness and their decisioning.
So that makes sense. In principle, these are serious issues, but what is the role of the board in cybersecurity? I mean, if we're talking about budget for a cybersecurity program for one of the sites, is that not the CIO's job or the CEO's job to authorize that budget? The board isn't going to authorize budget for a single program, are they? What does the board do?
I think you'll find in today's environment, the CISO is having more airtime with the board, and the CISO is actually being required to report to the board. So if there's an enterprise risk that has not been raised to the board level, that's a challenge, that's an issue. But moreover, if as a CISO of an organization, you want to be able to present, one, what are those risks, but you're also going to be going to the board and letting them know that you have a program to address that risk. Those programs come with cost, and aligning the board on those expenditures makes it much easier when the CIO is going in for budgeting, or depending upon where the CISO reports up to, whoever that leadership chain is asking for funding, it makes it much easier when it becomes a board level priority.
I would agree, especially as the executives, like the CISO that Anthony just mentioned, getting that face time in front of the board, right? It's part of that is selling to the board and putting the facts in front of them, and those facts are really around that risk, right? And that's where it's really key to involve the EH&S team as far as helping to identify that, because to me, that's what the leadership and the boards they understand that, the safety issues, especially when you're talking about process control in a chemical environment.
So Nate, let me add just a little context here. Anthony speaks from the perspective of the CISO. Historically, he was the CISO at a large chemicals organization. The CISO of a large industrial enterprise is concerned both about IT things and about, obviously the OT industrial security. Anthony's example, Shamoon, that was an attack on Saudi Aramco that, in my recollection, erased something like 30,000 hard drives on the IT network. Now, Aramco, said, look, there was no incident, no impact on OT. The refineries kept working. We had to, they obviously had to go out and buy 30,000 hard drives on an emergency basis and, repopulate their IT system. But that was really an IT impact. But as the CISO of an industrial enterprise, you care both about IT and OT security.
Andrew, I just want to give you one minor correction about what you're saying about Shamoon there. You are correct that there were no refineries shut down. All of the OT systems were perfectly fine. Nonetheless, the impact to IT did have an effect on the company's operations. Saudi Aramco mentioned, they said publicly that business was back to normal, but when a photographer visited the site, they caught this image of trucks lined up waiting for oil barrels. So what had happened was, by virtue of shutting down all of their IT systems, the company's operations were lagging, were basically frozen in place. So yeah, no OT systems down, but nonetheless, it did have a major impact on the operations of the company. Now, the thing that I was thinking about when with Anthony's answer just there is he made a really good point that especially if there is health and safety on the line, right? These are things that the executives at a company need to know about and need to be making the decisions about. On the other hand, I'm wondering if the executives are always the most qualified people to be making decisions about severe consequences caused by, interruptions or damages to OT systems, right? Because are these business decision makers also engineers? Do they have the right background to be making the right decisions here?
That's a good question, and it's a complicated answer. Some facts first. In my experience, the chief operating officer at large industrial enterprises is often an engineer, someone who came up through the ranks, someone who knows at least some of the systems very, very well. In a large enterprise, it's impossible to know all of the systems. There's just too much to know. In my experience, the CEO in large industrial enterprises might or might not be an engineer, because if you're going to run the business that is the enterprise, you need more than engineering knowledge. You need to understand, how to get customers. You need to understand how to sell this stuff. You need to understand how to work with the banks. You need to understand the regulatory environment. So, like I said, the CEOs might be an engineer. They might not. The board members will often include some engineers, but not all of the board members are engineers. And, it's complicated because, in a sense, there's too much to know. And so there is a degree of delegation. There's a degree of reporting. There's a degree of double checking. There's auditing that goes on. There's assessments that go on. There's reports that come up. So due diligence, I think, on the part of the board, a lot of it has to do with, have we had enough external experts coming in, checking on our own experts to make sure that we can trust the reports that our own experts are making to us. This kind of stuff is the questions the board ask. And they do make decisions about the very highest levels of risk and, what to do about it. But when we say what to do about it, it's not nuts and bolts, change this setting in the registry. It's very high level sort of direction that filters down again. Again, that makes sense in principle, but does the average board member really know enough about cybersecurity to be able to dig into this and ask the right questions?
Wow, that's a great question, Andrew. So I could tell you from my experience that a majority of CISOs, when they report quarterly to their board, they are talking in terms of the NIST CSF. And these are CISOs of multinational, and U.S.-based companies. But the NIST cybersecurity framework does a couple of things. So it says to the board in a common language because board members, remember, they're on a lot of other boards, and those boards are probably reporting up the same types of statistics. They could say, where do I fall from a cyber maturity perspective within my vertical? And where do I fall from an industry perspective overall? Because they need to be able to, they will be held accountable if there's a ransomware or a major enterprise risk that has not been addressed. So I do think that it is a level of awareness on the board, and I do believe that there's a common language.
So coming back to your first point, it's all about impact. But when we talk impact, you've mentioned a couple of high profile cases: the Shamoon attack, on the Saudi Aramco, the attack by the Russians on the Ukraine power grid. But when we talk about impact, a lot of people think quantity, and compared to the huge number of IT breaches that are reported every year, there's comparatively few OT breaches. Now, some of them have been, very high profile lately, but there's comparatively few of them. Do these numbers resonate with the board? Does this really prompt them to action?
I absolutely agree that, the quantity is important to measure, right? It's because a lot of times that's the message that sells to the board, right? That quantification makes it easier to sell to the board in a lot of cases, right? But it's not really about the numbers in this case. I agree. We do see far less incidents that are reported in OT as compared to IT. For a lot of that, just from the reasons that Anthony mentioned previously. But I think we've also been pretty fortunate for the most part so far, right, for cyber incidents in OT. And I think there are less breaches that haven't made the news that just go unreported. And a lot of that varies by industry, right, because some industries are required to report that, others are not. If they don't have a requirement to do that, often they don't, right, because there's implications of doing that, to their stock numbers and other areas there. But back to your question, do the fewer OT incidents like the ransomware resonate with the boards? As you know, Andrew, the three of us were preaching cybersecurity for all OT almost 20 years ago, right? I think we're finally starting to get some traction in the OT space, though. Ransomware, if you think about it, has become really a common buzzword. It's hard to hide from. There's been enough activity in the news in recent times that it's basically negligent not to acknowledge that and take the appropriate actions. The capabilities to attack OT environments are out there, certainly in abundance, right? If you think about malware and attack tools, those are readily available on the dark web. Zero-day vulnerabilities are also available on the dark web. And the bigger the impact for the vulnerability, the higher it costs. And nation states will pay that. But when it comes to OT, it's really about the potential of what the impact could be, right? And you have to think about that. The OT area of a manufacturing environment really doesn't have to be directly targeted in order to be impacted. There's often a much greater impact, as we talked about previously, when OT is affected versus an IT environment. But in many cases, OT environments make easier targets, right? They were not designed with security in mind. They were designed to run and run safely, right? But what makes this worse? OT environments typically don't have the same controls that you find in IT. There's often older systems that make up the OT environment. They're typically designed to run for 10, 20, maybe even 30 years or more in some cases without a refresh. There's less patching that takes place. Now, this may vary by industry. So if we go back to the power industry, NERC-CIP is driving, the mandate of patches every 35 days, right, after testing and due diligence. But most industries don't have that. But, getting to some of the couple of bigger issues that I see in the OT environment that put them at higher risk is a poor understanding of what is actually on the network. So there's lack of a real-time asset inventory. So first and foremost, I think you need to know what's on your network in order to protect it, right? We don't have the same tools. The tools are out there for OT. It's just that most organizations haven't gone down that path yet. But you need to understand what the asset is, what its attributes are, things like what type of device do I have on my network? What's the model? What's the OS or the firmware version that it has? And those are important attributes that you have to understand so that you can associate that with the known vulnerabilities or the CVEs that are associated with those assets. So that gives you some steps for mitigation or additional controls that you should put in place for that. The second one was really a lack of or poor network segmentation between IT and OT, or even just between different security zones. So poor network segmentation, and especially if you don't have it between IT and OT, allows malware to very easily propagate directly into the business, from the business network into manufacturing. So whether that's intentional or not, there can be very bad consequences when that happens. So, and there's a few ways that can be done, right, as far as segmentation. I say that as I'm talking to one of the industry experts in OT segmentation here. But, of course, there's firewalls that can be implemented between the security zones that have, making sure you have solid policies in place and least privilege multi-factor authentication, that's enforced for users going into the DMZ, because we know we don't want them going directly into the manufacturing or level 3 of the Purdue model. But some organizations don't even restrict their outbound communications because they're just not aware of the security implications that brings. So firewalls are not a one and done solution. They require updates, ongoing maintenance, revision to policies, and just, you have to stay on top of that and make sure that your controls and your policies are in place and up to date and commensurate. And then there's the unidirectional gateways, right? Andrew, as you know, very strong alternative to firewalls that physically only allow the data flows to go in one direction. And then there's the air gapping, right, where there's absolutely no physical connection at all between IT and OT. Some organizations think they're air gapped, and lo and behold, there's connections that either they weren't aware of or didn't think about. But basically, with an air gap network, that's becoming more and more difficult to achieve because businesses rely so much on that OT data, from that environment that they need in order to make informed business decisions. So this kind of goes into that IT-OT convergence and making use of that data, making value of it. So I do think as we continue to see the OT cyber incidents in the news more and more, such as the recent ransomware attack on JBS, right, the world's largest meat supplier, we're going to see both leadership and boards starting to take note, ask more questions about what their organizations are doing to prevent them from being in the news.
Waterfall Security Solutions is the OT security company. If you're wondering what is the difference between a unidirectional gateway and a firewall, or a so-called unidirectional firewall, then you'll be interested in Waterfall's latest ebook. Firewalls are used throughout both industrial networks and enterprise networks. But best practice demands something stronger, something truly unidirectional at the IT-OT interface. To see the difference that unidirectional security makes, please download the free ebook, Firewalls versus Unidirectional Gateways, from the Waterfall website under the Resources menu.
Immediately what stood out for me from Mike's answer there was, he mentions the breaches we know about, quote unquote. Now that raised a red flag in my head because I'm thinking, what breaches don't we know about? How many companies, how many places aren't reporting, and is that legal? Is that allowed? I know that in IT, that's something that happens sometimes. I can think of, for example, the case of Yahoo. They had a few breaches that they didn't immediately disclose when they were being bought out. There's a certain financial penalty to telling the world about getting breached. But my thought would be that with industrial systems, especially with the risks involved, that there would be no room to not tell people. But is that something you've heard about, Andrew?
It's complicated. Let me start with sort of the law in the IT space. The biggest law that requires disclosure is anything to do with personally identifiable information. If somebody leaks my credit card information and all of my personal details to the internet, they're required by law to tell me so that I can take measures to defend myself, so they can buy me insurance to defend myself, and so on. In the OT space, there's almost no such regulations. In North America, the NERC-CIP regulations demand that serious cybersecurity incidents be reported to NERC, and very high-level summaries of these incidents are published. There's been almost none of them. In the pipeline sector, there was an executive order just a couple of weeks ago ordering petrochemical pipelines to report incidents. They didn't used to have to do that. I'm pretty sure there's a mandate for that in the nuclear generation sector, but just about nowhere else that I'm aware of, is there a reporting requirement. So, and even if there is a reporting requirement, often it's to an authority who doesn't necessarily, a government authority who doesn't necessarily have to publish that information out to the world. It doesn't become public knowledge. Now, on the other hand, with the JBS breach recently, JBS said a little bit about it, but then the unions talked about it because they're not under, confidentiality agreements. They, one of the unions said, 10,000 of our people was laid off for, 5 or 6 days or something like this, or 2 or 3 days. I forget the details. But, the bigger the shutdown, the harder it is to keep quiet, especially if people have been laid off. If people haven't been laid off, and if you have either a culture or a legal framework where you just don't talk about your employer's business, especially if they continue paying you. I have heard of incidents. I mean, this was 20 years ago, incidents where entire plastics factories were shut down and, the plastic hardened in the pipes and they had to rip everything out, rip and replace. Never made the news. But there's rumors of it in the industry, and presumably never made the news because there was no legal requirement, and because the workers didn't say anything about it, and so it's not public knowledge. So it's complicated. You don't have to disclose these. If there's a virus gets loose on your plant, and you do the risk assessment, and you say it's trying to steal credit card numbers. There's no credit card numbers. I see no impact. I'm going to leave it until 3 months from now when I have a downtime scheduled anyway. I'm going to clean it out then. That class of incident, is likely never to get reported. It's not serious enough. So it's complicated, but not everything gets reported. Not everything has to be reported.
I see. And the other thing that stood out to me from his answer was with regards to, I believe that he mentioned that OT systems are, or at least he implied that OT systems are inherently a bit more vulnerable than IT systems, which I would imagine refers to the fact that operational equipment tends to be a little bit older, and so it might be running old versions of Windows OS, not necessarily built to defend against more modern threats. But my impression has always been that industrial people take security very, very seriously, in maybe even more so than IT people, because of the risks of physical danger, so that these systems end up being much more secure than in IT, where sort of a breach is more of a business cost. Am I wrong?
Again, the answer is complicated. It depends on the enterprise. It depends on the industry. Certain industries, nuclear generation has been a leader in the cybersecurity space kind of forever because they have to be. I think I've said on previous episodes, rail systems worldwide have sort of woken up to the risk and said, oh, shoot, we're in trouble. We have to fix this. And they're doing stuff to fix it. But lots of other industries, it's all over the place. There are leaders who, take things more seriously. There are laggards who really aren't aware of the risk, or if they are, they've dismissed it, and they're not doing much at all. And to Mike's point, whether you take the risk seriously or not, a lot of people are reluctant to rip and replace very old systems that still work because they're so tightly tied to physical processes, because they've been certified to work correctly against the physical process. And it's just going to be a lot of effort to try and recertify something new. You incur a whole bunch of additional risks every time you change anything. And so cybersecurity initiatives often focus on, call it the perimeter, unidirectional gateways, firewalls, air gaps, because trying to do something about sort of the soft, chewy interior is just so hard. It's easier to harden the perimeter. All of these are part of the answer. It's just complicated. This is the problem with OT security. This is why we have a podcast, because it's complicated. So thanks for that, Mike. It sounds though like a lot of detail. Do the boards really get involved in things like asset inventory? I mean, you gave the example of the Colonial Pipeline. The bad guys said, if we believe them, I mean, they're criminals. You don't know if you can believe them. They said, oops, we didn't mean to shut the pipeline down. Sorry, guys. It suggests to me that if the bad guys, if we believe them, and I'm not sure we do, if we believe them, they could have done much worse. What is the lesson that boards are going to take away from the Colonial Pipeline incident?
I think the question is, when the CISO together with the CIO go to the board and they're presenting on cyber, I know for a fact they will ask, Are we prepared for such an attack? What is are we at risk of this? Are we going to be the next ones on the newspaper or CNN? And that's a very valid question because it is an enterprise risk. The security leaders, the IT leaders need to be prepared to answer that question. They're not going to address it in asset inventory terms, but they're going to address it in what is my risk and what have you done institutionally to ensure that that's not going to happen to this company. It will be a board level discussion.
I would add, it kind of goes back to our previous discussion around the NIST cybersecurity framework, just getting that common board level language, right? That it kind of establishes those very basic controls or practices that you should have for basic cyber hygiene, right? So the board asking those questions, how does a compromise my business network affect us shutting down the pipeline? Those answers start to surface, right? If you're not doing that very basic cyber hygiene. Right, so tying that back into that NIST CSF language, right, I think can help further that conversation and sell that message.
So it sounds like you've just described what you have to do. Use the NIST framework, build out a robust, comprehensive program. But then, the second part of the question, can you address that one? How do you turn it around? How do you persuade the board? How do you develop the board's trust that you've done the right thing?
Remember, I said earlier, communicating with the board is all about your vocabulary. And so I'm going to go just a little bit deeper on what the CISO would need to do, but the CISO is going to have to translate this into a board level response. So developing trust in your capabilities, that CISO is going to have to sell the fact that they've done the right thing. That they understand, that the CISO understands that both the maturity of their process and their practice is in line or better than their industry peers. That's first. So we're talking about comparison. You could do that within the NIST CSF, but you have to get down into the weeds with your teams in order to do those assessments. You also need to have a solid understanding of your IT and OT sensor array. Now, you're not going to say those words to a board, by no means, but there are metrics that you're going to get from your incident response team. Specifically, for instance, dwell time of an attack. You're going to have dwell time of an attack on your IT side. You're going to have dwell time of an attack on your OT side. Are they the same? Are they dissimilar? But you have to understand and be the salesman to translate, I don't have the sensor array that I need. I'm going to need funding. I'm going to have to turn this into a pitch, so to speak, with the board. You're going to have practices. You might have to hire people to actually test your sensor array to make sure that you have the right rigors. And Mike mentioned policies and processes in place. For instance, not having the right processes on or rigor around change management on your firewall, you could actually disable alerting on your sensor array within your OT, and then you wouldn't know. So you have to have the right staffing. It's the people, process, and technology in order to answer the questions that you'll need to take to the board. And finally, and this might involve the board or your executive leadership, I've run these with executive leaderships with DuPont, and that you need to have tabletops. You need to ensure that your board understands what their role is, that the CISO and that his team and the CIO and the rest of IT, they understand what their role is in the event of a cyber incident. And that's critical because as a board member, you might find that you're in front of a microphone as something happened. You need to be prepared and know how to respond. And they might look back to the CISO and ensuring that those preparations are there.
So thanks, guys. This has been great. Before we leave you, is there a thought you'd like to leave with our listeners?
I guess my question is, how do companies maintain an evergreen capability to ensure that they're really prepared for the threats of tomorrow? We've talked about the evolution of threats. How do companies know if you've implemented segmentation, say back in 2005, how do you know it's still working today? What are you doing to ensure an evergreen process?
The threats to companies or organizations have really evolved significantly over the years there. But if you think about the age of our OT systems and even just their fragility, the threats out there don't have to be that advanced, right? The old attacks still work on these. Given the reliance on the OT data, there's more connectivity to the business network and even to the cloud than there has ever been before. So if you tie in the impact that a cyber attack can have on an OT environment, you have to weave cyber into the safety culture. You have to get your EH&S team engaged. And if it's not already, cyber needs to have board level attention. But just like other security controls, risk assessments, while they're required, are not a one and done. The threats evolve and your cybersecurity program must stay evergreen to be commensurate with those attacks. And there's no solution that's a silver bullet here. So make sure you have a solid incident response plan, that you practice it often. Anthony, to your point, with tabletop exercises are a great way to do that. Just be collaborative with the IT and OT groups. Similarly, controls effectiveness are not one and done. Platforms change. So make sure you continue to evolve your cyber defenses and test them often. So I'll just leave it with, we understand process control. We understand discrete manufacturing. We've been engaged in many different verticals and really been working to secure OT environments for the past 2 decades. So if you need assistance, be it a NIST CSF assessment, risk assessment, guidance on appropriate network segmentation, or just preparing for a ransomware attack, you can find both of us, Anthony and I, on LinkedIn. So reach out to us for any questions that you have. We'd love to hear from you and have a discussion and share our thoughts with you. So you can also visit our webpage at www.level5cyber.com. For more information, you can contact us through there as well.
Andrew, how about you close things out here for us?
Well, I learned a few things this episode. One is that when it comes to cybersecurity, it's all about risk. Boards care about risk. It's their job to figure out how much risk to accept versus how much risk to do something about. And when it comes to industrial cyber risk, the big question is always, well, how much is enough? And what I heard was that one tool to answer that question is, are we in line or are we better than our industry peers? And a second tool is, do we have all the pieces? This is the NIST framework. The framework is a checklist. I mean, the NIST framework doesn't even say the word firewall in it. It's a very high-level checklist. But it lets the board go through and say, do we have all of the elements of a proper cybersecurity program? Do we have one of these? Do we have one of those? Do we have one of those? So, the framework is another tool that I was surprised to learn that boards are using when they talk to their cybersecurity executives. And the third thing I took away from the episode was about attacks. I've maintained for some time that business decision makers understand attacks much more readily than they understand the nuts and bolts of, firewall rules or two-factor authentication. What I heard Anthony say that the board is going to ask, they're going to ask, where would we be if that attack happened to us? So they use their understanding of attacks to evaluate risk, to evaluate how much trouble they're in. So, it's all about risk. How do we line up with our peers? How do we line up with the NIST framework? And how much trouble would we be in if the latest big attack happened to us? Those are my takeaways.
All right. Well, thanks to Michael Piccalo and Anthony Morrone for speaking with you, Andrew. And as always, Andrew, thank you for speaking with me.
Always a pleasure, Nate. Thank you.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thanks to everyone out there listening.